As a crisis communicator, it's important to recognize what a crisis is and equally important to understand what it's not. Depending on who you talk to, there are a handful of dictionary type definitions of crisis. But in this presentation, we go a little deeper by examining the ingredients, or the elements as I call them, that come together to define a true crisis. And I have found that understanding the chemistry and interactions of these elements will give you a jump on managing crises as they emerge. The first element of crisis is the issue. Now, I call this the base element because issues are the fertile ground from which all crises spring. You simply cannot have a true crisis if it isn't rooted in some type of issue. So let me explain. So for the purpose of this discussion, the characteristics of an issue are that it is a matter in dispute with two or more opposing views, and that it is ongoing with no real clear beginning or endpoint. Example of these include those listed here. We often see people confuse an issue with an incident, but note how these are not specific incidents. Each is something ongoing with varying opinions as to their severity, impact, or how they should be managed. I equate the issue to fuel. An issue is to a crisis what fuel is to a fire. A crisis can't grow without an issue any more than a flame can grow into a fire without a fuel source. Therefore, an issue by itself is not evidence of impending crisis, nor is it something to be overly concerned with as a communicator, but it is something to be aware of and possibly to manage if you can. The second element of a crisis is the emergency. This is tantamount to a heat source for the crisis. For our purposes, we define an emergency as a sudden, unexpected event requiring an immediate response, and unlike an issue, it has a very clear beginning and a very clear endpoint. Examples of an emergency include what you see here. If the issue is fuel, that means the emergency is a flame. And like an issue, though, an emergency by itself does not mean a crisis event is imminent, especially if the response is quick and effective. That said, when an emergency occurs that involves a related issue, such as an oil spill in an environmentally sensitive area or a security breach involving customers' private information, now you have favorable conditions. Again, now this doesn't mean that a crisis is imminent. If the oil spill is in Houston, say, instead of San Francisco, the issue or the fuel won't be as volatile. But to a crisis communication pro, this simply means at this point your spidey senses should be tingling. Once the favorable conditions have been set, you'll want to be cognizant of the different catalysts and free radicals, as I call them, that enter into the crisis equation. Knowing what these are will give you an opportunity to get ahead of the impending crisis. The first catalysts will reveal themselves early on in the incident. This is when the response to an emergency doesn't go as smoothly as expected, or mistakes are made in the early stages. When this happens, the crisis comms pro starts to look for the free radicals that begin to appear as things heat up. I like to think of these as the proverbial red flags or the canaries in a coal mine. The more of these you see, the greater probability a crisis situation is developing. The first red flag is the threat to public safety, health, and/or the environment is elevated. The next thing to look for is that media attention grows beyond the local. The result is more eyes on your operations and less room for error. A critical incident is never a positive thing, but when the tone and focus begins to shift from the who, what, where, and when to the how and why, and if mistakes are being made, either real or perceived, people will start to cast a villain. As things start to take on a life of their own, the demand for information will soon exceed anyone's ability to meet it. This is when the media and the public begin looking to other sources of information, valid or otherwise. The international media attention, public scrutiny, and a runaway information train inevitably create a ripe environment for political theater. If constituents are unhappy, elected officials are unhappy. And if there's a camera involved, there are opportunities for elected officials to make hay. When this happens, the entities responsible are almost always cast in that villain role. When the regulators get involved, you've now lost any control over the story you may have had. Often the involvement of a regulatory body can be a tipping point on the road to crisis. For example, Major League Baseball was facing the issue of steroids. The emergency here was the discovery that noteworthy players were using them. Once the U.S. Congress decided to get involved, the steroids crisis took on a whole new look. A second catalyst, and almost always the element that causes the crisis reaction, is mishandling of public information. Poor communication will make things worse when operations are going poorly, and will create the perception operations are going poorly even if they're going well. Now that's worth restating. Even if your organization has responded effectively and is bringing the incident under control, poor communication is all that's required to spark a crisis. And what makes a crisis so much worse than a problematic issue or incident, an emergency or other critical event? Damage to or complete loss of public stakeholder trust and support and understanding. This leads to difficulty in the operational response as public sentiment drives those operational decisions. Routine operations get put under a microscope, scrutinized, and questioned. Employee and responder morale drops, impacting organizational effectiveness, increasing chances that more mistakes are made, and future organizational strategy, mission, and effectiveness becomes uncertain. Pause a moment and think of some examples on your own. And what are the long-term impacts? How about erosion of organizational legitimacy? In the months after Hurricane Katrina, FEMA struggled with the public's loss of confidence in the agency as a legitimate disaster relief organization, so much so that towns in the aftermath were refusing their help. How about mission reversal? After the last, most recent shuttle explosion, NASA faced the possibility of scrubbing the shuttle program altogether and suspending manned missions into space because popular sentiment was starting to doubt it. Organizational identity disturbed and relevancy erased. There are a laundry list of companies, organizations, and agencies who have been forced to rebrand themselves to escape public perception. After the Deepwater Horizon spill in the Gulf of Mexico in 2010, the agency responsible for regulating offshore drilling operations, the Minerals Management Service, had to completely change its name and now operates as the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, Regulation, and Enforcement. So now it's your turn to put a crisis under the microscope and identify the key elements. Now, if you're watching this as part of our virtual collaborative communication for critical incidents workshop, use one of the 2 case studies that came with the package. If not, try breaking down an event that you're familiar with and see if you can label these key elements. So there you have it. Crisis broken down into its base ingredients. Just like a doctor that can't prescribe a course of treatment without understanding the biology of an illness, or a mechanic who can't fix a car without understanding how the different parts of an engine interact, a crisis communicator cannot manage emerging crisis without knowing the different elements that create one. If you're interested in learning more about advanced critical incident and crisis communication tools in a small group setting alongside other professionals in your field, our next skills workshop is August 3rd and 4th in Clearwater, Florida. Visit us at sean-douglas.com and visit our workshop page for information on the Clearwater dates, as well as other cities we plan to visit this year.